Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. We've been having a journey with George Harrison these past few videos, and it's been a great experience to learn more about this very talented man. George wasn't perfect, but nobody is, and he was loved by all who met him due to his charisma. We are going to see how George reacted to Eric's claim of love for his wife, Pattie, and then what happened with George after him and Pattie decided to separate. So George was more open. Pattie was hoping against hope that she could still make her marriage work with George, and he had become cold and distant, but she had hoped that he would return to the man he was when they first married. It didn't seem to be happening because when they were going to take a drive to the south of France and Portugal, he had the front seat reserved for Krishna, and he later told a Swami that he had drove for 23 hours and chanted all the way. So it wasn't clear if Pattie was in the back seat, but if she was, it must have been a rough trip to take. And then George had been discreet in his affairs with other women, but when Eric told George he loved Pattie, George didn't try to hide what he was up to. He would have affairs with friends of Pattie's, even at Friar Park. And around this time, George was helping Ronnie Wood from the soon-to-be Rolling Stones write a song Far East Man for his debut solo album. And the Woods lived nearby. When Ronnie was on the road with the Small Faces band, his wife Chrissy would spend nights at Friar Park. And George told Pattie nothing was going on, and she was being paranoid. Then in the summer of 1973, George told Pattie he didn't want to go with her to Portugal for a vacation. He went instead to Spain with Chrissy Wood to visit the painter Salvador Dali. And when Ronnie returned home, he went to Friar Park and stayed there a few days, just as a friend, supposedly. So in the early 1970s, the book George Harrison, The Reluctant Beatle by Philip Norman said that wife swapping was going on then. And Ron Wood wrote in a biography, and he said he took George to the side and told him he would be going to Pattie's room that night. And then George pointed to the room where Chrissy was and said he would be in that room. So they stood by the bedroom doors, and Ronnie asked George, "Are we really going to do this?" And George said, "I'll see you in court." Then they went to the rooms that they appointed him. Next, George decided to have an affair with Ringo's wife, even though the Beatles had always said to each other that they would never sleep around with another Beatles wife. Pattie had her suspicions. The first thing she discovered when she returned home from a visit to her mother were some photographs that George had taken of Maureen at Friar Park. Then she saw Maureen wearing a necklace and found out George had given it to her, and George wouldn't admit to anything when she confronted him. Things got more out of hand when Pattie would find herself alone in Friar Park's Great Hall, and George would be with Maureen in the studio, saying she was there to listen to music with George in the studio. So Pattie stated that Maureen had an attitude that she had the right to spend the night with George if she felt like it. And one day they even continued to see each other in the daytime. George and Maureen went to one of the bedrooms upstairs while musicians were waiting for George in his recording studio. And then one day, George brought Pattie a cup of tea in the bed and told her that he was in love with Maureen. Pattie tried to tell Ringo, and he hadn't known about it and went into a rage. He didn't want to listen to her. And things came out in the open when George, Pattie, and Chris were having dinner with Ringo and Maureen at Tittenhurst Park, their home. Long kitchen table, and George told Ringo, "I'm in love with your wife," in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Chris said it got silent, and then Ringo looked at George and said, "Better you than someone we don't know." So when Ringo and Maureen held a New Year's Eve party, George had left the house without Pattie. She had gone back into the house to get something she forgot. And when she got to the party, George said to her, "Let's have a divorce this year." They stayed married a few more months after that. Maureen and Ringo's marriage would end also because they were divorced the following year. John would describe it as virtual incest, and later when someone tried to ask George about it, he would say incest, and they knew they needed to stop asking. So at this time, Eric gets off heroin. Eric got over his addiction by a process called neuroelectric therapy, sort of like acupuncture, and Eric had his career going positively with a new band. Eric made frequent visits to Friar Park, and Pattie said, "George must have realized we were having an affair, but he never said so." She said also that she felt he wanted to break rid of me. We were like chopsticks joined together and cracking apart. Before Eric was to go to America, he decided to ask Pattie if she wanted to join him. So he brought along a few musician friends to keep George occupied while he asked her. Pattie hesitated. Months later, she went to George, who was working in his studio late at night, and she said she couldn't stand their ludicrous and hateful life. And George told her he would make it better, and she said half of her wanted to believe it. And when they went to bed together, he said to her, "Don't go." But she left the next day. She had plans to fly to Los Angeles and stay with her sister Jenny, who was married to the rock star Mick Fleetwood. And she found out that George had canceled her credit cards. Clapton was in America, and he got wind of what was going on and phoned her at Jenny's and asked to meet her, and this time she said yes. George said by the time that Pattie had left, they had lived separate lives so long, he didn't notice the final break. But I don't think this was true because he was embarrassed that he was walked out on. He started to drink 5-star brandy and put away a whole bottle at one sitting. And he also continued using cocaine and weed. It didn't take George long to rebound, though, and he started to date again in a couple of weeks. He started dating Kathy Simmons, and she had dated Rod Stewart. And during this time, he also went to India to spend time with Ravi Shankar to see his new house, and he stayed there for 2 months. So whenever somebody asked George what was going on about Eric and Pattie, and if he was going to write a rebuttal song to Layla, George said that Eric Clapton's been a close friend for years, and I'm very happy about it. The person asking the question asked, "How can you be happy about it?" And George said, "Because he's great. I'd rather she was with him than some dope." George met Olivia when he went to the A&M office. She was 26 years old at this time and working in the marketing department, and A&M was a distributor of his Dark Horse label. And she went with George on his Dark Horse tour, and it seemed to be love at first sight. While on tour with him, she had a soothing effect on him. She tried to keep him from drinking and drugging as much. And Chris O'Dell, his one-time assistant, said that George was more physically demonstrative with Olivia than she'd ever known him. They would hold hands, and George snuggled up to Olivia whenever he could. So at this time, Pattie was seeing a difference between George and Eric. When Pattie was married to George, she didn't go on tour with him. With Eric, she did. And when he sang Layla, she felt an overwhelming passion. Her love for George had been deep and gentle. Eric had pursued Pattie for 5 years, and she was the only woman for him. But then once he got her, temptations were starting to get to him. Pattie found out that Eric gave up heroin, but then he turned into an alcoholic. He, like George, went for brandy with 7-Up, and he started drinking it right after breakfast. Pattie said she was in love with Eric, but she realized what a wreck he was. Before Pattie left Friar Park, George told Pattie she could always come back if things didn't work out between her and Eric. And George at one time sent Eric and Pattie a note that said, E+P, God bless us all, love from G. And Chris O'Dell paid Pattie a visit, and she encouraged Pattie to call Friar Park and George. But at this time, Eric came into the room, and he felt that Pattie was trying to go get back to George. Pattie ended up locking herself in the bathroom, and Eric kicked the door so hard he fractured his toe. By December, Pattie moved into Eric's house, Hurtwood Edge. George was self-sufficient, but Eric had everything done for him. His manager did everything. Eric never did any household chores, and Pattie found drawers full of uncashed checks that he never bothered to cash. Pattie's family loved George, but they didn't feel the same way about Eric. They knew how he had used Pattie's sister, and Eric didn't really care for her family either. George wasn't the possessive type, at least not until the end of the marriage, but Eric was. He would follow Pattie around to make sure she wasn't meeting up with someone else. And one Christmas day, George turned up to Eric's house to visit. So Pattie and Eric were there, as well as assorted guests at lunch. Pattie felt guilty eating turkey when George arrived, but Eric had not wanted to be a vegetarian, so she gave it up. George made a joke out of it, and Pattie offered him wine and Christmas pudding, and they talked without being awkward. Eric felt the need to keep apologizing for what had happened. George wasn't annoyed, and that made Eric annoyed. So George felt it was convenient for him what had happened, and he now had another love to be with. George and Eric stayed friends and became even closer, and it made Pattie feel invisible. She said those two were so tight, I was just the one in the middle. When George was handling his plagiarism case, he started to lose a lot of weight, and his skin was turning yellowish. He was diagnosed with hepatitis B, a liver disorder, and it was caused by alcohol abuse. George thought he could cure himself by chanting, but Olivia got him to see a doctor. That didn't help either, so Olivia had him see an acupuncturist, and he was able to get back to himself again. George went with Olivia to see the house she grew up in. She was embarrassed by George seeing it, but he said it was a mansion compared to where he grew up. And then George spent time back at Friar Park gardening. Olivia would handle calls from lawyers and accountants, and gardening was like meditating for George. Olivia encouraged him to get to know his fellow Henley neighbors, and they would go to Row Barge, a pub, and the owners treated them like everyone else. It's at this time that George marries and has a child. George and Olivia were going to be married in May because they were going to have a baby by midsummer. George's father, Harold, died in May, so they didn't marry until the birth of Danny, and he was born August the 1st. A month later, George and Olivia married at Henley on the Thames Register office. Once this happened, George's assistant, Terry Doran, was let go after 10 years of service. He called Pattie to tell her the news and was in tears. Pattie and Eric got married in 1979. Pattie recalled a time when she and Eric were sitting with George in the Great Hall in Friar Park, and she wasn't living there at that time. George said, "I suppose I better divorce her." And Clapton answered, "Well, if you do, I suppose that means I've got to marry her." They acted like she wasn't there listening to them. On one early morning on December 9th, Olivia answered the phone, and George's sister Louise called to say that John Lennon had been shot 5 times in the back and had died in an emergency room. George's first public reaction didn't show him to be very caring. George said that when Olivia woke him up with the news, he turned over and went back to sleep. And when I woke up, it was still true. Well, this could have been a case of shock that was doing that too. And when John died, George and John hadn't been talking to each other for years. They had a rift because John felt that he should have had more of a presence in George's book. And in 1981, George wrote a tribute to John entitled All Those Years Ago. George said in the song he always looked up to John, and you imagined it. He also said, you imagined it, although not many had ears at that time, and then he was treated like a dog. I'm sure John would have appreciated the song. So I'm going to end the video here. We saw how Pattie and George had a love even though George wasn't faithful, and after a while, Pattie wasn't either. George didn't take long to rebound, and Pattie started to have doubts about Eric, realizing he wasn't the same as George was. Friar Park saw the addition of Olivia and Danny and the departure of Terry Doran, an assistant for George for 10 years. The next episode, we'll see what George is up to in the 1980s. He's in his 40s by then, and we'll see what he was up to during that time. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. Also, click on the notification bell if you haven't already, so you can be notified when new videos are released. So I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.